And now you have the Tiangong, the Chinese space station in orbit. And the latest news just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, maybe even less, they were talking about how they had new satellite guard dogs, quote unquote, that were being put around that could potentially move or grapple with hostile or potentially hostile objects.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. According to a CBS YouGov poll, 67%, that's 2/3 of Americans want to see the United States return to the moon. And most, 77%, believe that U.S. space programs generate technological contributions from which everyone can benefit. And yet, the Trump administration wants to chop 25% out of NASA's budget, mostly from science programs. But it also zeroes out funding for the only human-rated capsule and rocket system capable of reaching the moon. That's the SLS, or the Space Launch System, rocket, and Orion spacecraft. It flew an uncrewed round-trip mission to the moon in November 2022. That was the Artemis 1 mission. The White House plan is for it to fly 2 more times, culminating in Artemis 3, which is a boots and flags mission, and then no more. That's contrary to the first Trump administration's plan, which included more Artemis missions, with the end goal of establishing a permanent lunar base before the Chinese do. In fact, that base is what most partners like ESA and JAXA and the nations that signed the Artemis Accords expect. And truth be told, really, the SLS is a funding and schedule debacle. But hey, it's the only ride to the moon that we know works. On Capitol Hill, the president's budget plan for NASA is facing solid bipartisan opposition. Both the Senate and the House bills keep NASA funding at just under $25 billion, which is only slightly less than what NASA received for this year. And that's just the moon missions. There seems to be a retrenchment of any space mission that is not connected with Golden Dome. You may have heard that the administration wishes to bin the Commerce Department's new traffic coordination system for space, which ironically is a Trump 1.0 initiative. So while all of this slashing of budgets is going on, there are some developments in China that we need to keep an eye on. And for that, we have Josh Carslon. He's the author of the book Spacepower Ascendant, Space Development Theory, and a New Space Strategy. Here's our conversation. Hey, Josh, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to be back on again.
Now, you are a book author, a blue water space power advocate, and more. So please take a moment and introduce yourself, like where you are, what you do. Josh?
Well, thank you. So my name is Josh Carlson. I published the book Spacepower Ascendant back in 2020 that tried to look at different ways to view the space domain as more of a progression rather than in a military lens or in other lenses, trying to look at it for what it is. Since then, I've continued to be very invested in the space domain, continued to advocate for space development. And I do also want to say that the views expressed here are my own, and so they do not reflect any official policy or position of the U.S. government or any other group.
But why do you have to say that, though? You got to actually expound on why you just said those words.
Yeah. So in my professional career, I am also a civilian in the Space Force, and so I do work in this area. But while I'm here, I'm presenting my own authorial perspectives and just being able to read the news stories off the internet as anybody else could. And so I do have to say that up front that I'm presenting my own opinions and nothing official.
Exactly. And I just like to foot stomp on that because the subject of this episode is definitely not what Josh does. So So much has happened in space since Donald Trump returned to the White House, right? I mean, not the least of which is Golden Dome or next generation missile defense, right? The president's desire to reduce NASA's budget by just over 24%. That's got to hurt. But, both the Senate and the House are rejecting that. And so keep an eye on that. And there's also the Trump-Elon Musk bromance breakup that has imperiled SpaceX's government contracts. Trump has threatened to cancel government contracts with all of Musk's various companies. There's a lot of stuff to distract us and keep our attention off of China. But I know that you're actually paying attention. So since Trump has taken office, there have been a number of really important space and defense developments coming out of the People's Republic of China, the PRC. And I'm wondering which ones are actually the most strategic.
Yeah, Laura, thank you for the question. If I could actually go back real quick to the opening monologue, I think there's something really interesting about Trump that a lot of folks don't understand. And that is that he grew up as essentially as a movie star. He's a people person. He understands how to grab headlines and he understands how to grab attention. He's really good at both of those. And he's also good at negotiation. And we'll get back into that, I think, at the end as we start looking ahead to the negotiation that's going on. And I think in this first story, I think there's a very interesting negotiation going on as well between China and America in regards to Chile. So the first one, this was back from April. It's in South America, so it might have gone under some people's radar. But China has been trying to work with Chile to stand up and partner with a observatory in Chile. America has not been particularly happy about this. And in April, what was breaking was that the Chilean government came out and said, yes, actually, this is illegal, what China is attempting to do. That's very interesting on two respects. What
was China trying to do, though?
Well, so China claimed that they were wanting to set up a civilian observation purely as part of it's in the Atacama Desert, this particular observatory. It looks south, and obviously in the Western Hemisphere because it's, South America. And they claimed that they were just wanting to partner with the academic institution and do good science, all of that. America claimed that that China would be using it to potentially track satellites, using it as another tracking capability that would potentially allow them to do stuff that we don't want them to do, basically.
So what was the deal breaker that was, falling foul of Chilean law?
So that's not mentioned in the article, and I couldn't find, what exactly they were saying. The interesting thing, because governmental negotiation sometimes, I find, looks like lawfare, would be how we would describe it, or legal bent one way or the other. Because obviously, so a great example of law not holding true would be back from the South China Sea when China made the islands and was infringing on the Filipino islands as well. The international court said China can't do that, and China said, our legal experts said that actually we can, so we're just going to keep doing it, basically. And so legally, they basically said, yeah, this isn't going to work. I don't have any insight into this other than what is in the news, but it looks to me that if Chile really wanted China, and by the way, Chile has a major trading partner with China. By some estimates, they have about 40% of their trade with China. We only trade about 18-20%. So trade-wise, China trades a lot with Chile, which is why it's very interesting that the court decided to find against the Chinese use of this observatory. And apparently in this case, at least in this particular case, part of a balancing act, trying to at least give the United States this because apparently this was very, very important to us, or China wasn't able to put appropriate counterbalances in place for the decision process. But it's very interesting that I couldn't find any stories after April specifying what exactly happened. Did they fully stop it? Is it being reconsidered and maybe in a different location? Whatever. But in this particular case, the fact that there was that legal finding and that the Chilean government backed it up and everything is very interesting. It appears to be, in my mind, at least a decent setback to China, assuming that China wanted to do something with it because they were trying to do it. So chronologically going forward, so in May, China signed a deal with Russia for Russia to create the space nuclear reactor that they were planning on putting in an International Lunar Research Station on the moon. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. I'll first go back to my book real quick. So in Spacepower Ascendant, I talk about the space development theory, which suggests there are 3 specific phases of development that all domains go through, space being a domain, like land, air, sea, space. And then there's a 4th one that you can do at any time. And so the first one, real quick for background, is exploration. That's you go and come back because you're just trying to find out what's there. The second is expansion. You go and stay there and you set up permanent stuff. And then now that you're there permanently, now I start making money off of it. That's exploitation is the word I use for it. And then finally, at any point in this development, obviously we live in a world that is not perfect. And so maybe someone wants to take my stuff. And so exclusion is the ability to keep people out that might be hostile or hold hostile intent to what is going on. Now, why is all of this important? We always like to say that we went to the moon first. True, we landed 69. That was exploration, though. We went and came back. And then in the 80s, we actually stopped going to the moon entirely. Nobody basically has been to the moon prior to Chandrasekharan and some of the other recent ones. Is recent, I believe it was but 2012. I might be a little off on the dates. But, I mean, for about 30 years there, nobody went to the moon, really. Now we're all going back, and lots of missions are going back. And most importantly, not only are these are not explorations. This is a base on the moon. This is permanent placement. This is now expansion. This is a new phase of development. The first time that we have seen this particular phase on the moon, very, very important. And they are talking about putting it on the South Pole. As we know, there's lots of lunar ice probably in that area, which you could use. You can convert that into propellant. You can use that for water. Potentially, you could, if you have enough of it, you could use it for crops, reuse it for other things.
Oxygen is important.
Oxygen, yes. And the space nuclear is important because the South Pole also has the peaks of eternal light. So you get lots of solar power. But having a backup nuclear reactor also allows you to maintain power even if you do lose solar connection. As at least a backup, depending on the size of the reactor.
Some places too, though, right, that are near the South Pole. I mean, there is a lunar night down there, and that lunar night is, I believe it's about 13 days, Earth days. So there is lunar night, and that's why some things that have made it to the lunar surface, they die in that lunar night because the temperatures go so far south that it cracks the system. So having a nuclear power source would be kind of important.
Yeah, and I'd have to go back and look at the peaks of eternal light to make sure. I believe that it's one of the reasons that particular location is really important. That is actually almost constant solar because it's like right on the South Pole. So you basically are getting sun whatever direction you're in, but the reason
but once you leave that, once you
leave it, you're in trouble. Yes.
Yeah.
Or you don't have that at the very least. Now, ILRS is interesting as well. Obviously,
ILRS is...
I'm sorry. International Lunar Research Station, the name for the Chinese and Russian base.
Thank you.
And originally this was a Chinese thought. The Russians signed on to it, which made the ILRS. And then I believe the last count was they had about 16 different nations or 17 different nations now that have signed on to it, including Egypt, Pakistan, Venezuela, South Africa. Noting that this is in competition to Artemis, who I believe last count was about 50 nations that signed on to the American-led lunar base that is also planned, or lunar establishment that is also planned. But this was very important, the announcement that they were going to put a nuclear reactor on the moon, ostensibly for basing, and the fact that this is continued development of the plan that was penciled in a couple of years ago and is getting filled out with these details on why it's so important.
So this is, just to wrap it up and put a bow on it. I mean, having a nuclear reactor as a power source there is quintessential of expansion and then going into exploitation, because of course you're going to need energy to do both of those things, right? So that's the big stuff. But what's flying under the radar?
Funny you mentioned flying under the radar. So the Chinese Aerospace Studies Institute out of Air University also put out an update in June, so last month, talking about how the Chinese have put out bidding in February for low lunar orbit remote sensing satellites.
I saw that. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
It is, because once again, just like you have satellites overhead, we have like Maxar and all sorts of commercial organizations here on Earth that provide imagery that you can buy on your phone, actually.
And imagery of the Earth, though, right?
Yes, imagery of the Earth in this case. It's imagery constantly flying overhead. Lots of people can buy it.
So if we take a look at the moon,
this is now looks
mapping.
like they are trying to set it up for the moon as well, which would be
that's
a first.
A mapping thing, right? I mean, and we had a mapping mission, but that mission got canceled, if I'm not mistaken.
Mapping, but I mean, depending on all sorts of revisit rates and all sorts of things, how good of a awareness will this allow them to have? But this is not the first thing that China has done in relation to the moon, in particular. That is a first. They do have a comms satellite orbiting Earth-Moon Lagrange Point 2, which is the one behind the moon.
They've got two satellites there.
And that allows them, yes, and that allows them to communicate to their rover on the far side, which is they were the first nation to do that.
And that's how they're able to grow crops there, actually, as well. Hey, there's something that I thought was really interesting that I think is kind of flying under the radar. It's not that people aren't paying attention to Chinese launches or Chinese rocket development. I mean, people do write about this all the time, but just sort of standing back a little bit, what I find really interesting is that there is a race in China between Chinese, quote unquote, commercial rocket companies. I do say quote unquote on purpose here. But anyway, we've got three companies, right? Land Space, Galactic Energy, and China's iSpace. That is not the Japanese exploration company that just tried to land on the moon. This is a Chinese company that is using the same name. All three, though, are slated to launch a reusable rocket this year, right? Galactic Energy is going to launch the Pallas 1 before the end of the year. iSpace wants to launch their Hyperbola 3 also before the end of the year. And Land Space, they want to launch the Zhuke 3 this year in the last quarter. And what's interesting about the Land Space rocket is that it is methane fuel, two-stage, and they think that they can reduce launch costs by 80 to 90%. That seems pretty dang strategic, though.
It absolutely is. The majority of, or at least a very significant portion of the cost that it takes to get to space is in the launch vehicle, it's in the fuel, it's in the approach that you're taking to get to space. Which is one of the reasons why SpaceX has been such a critical part of assisting the U.S. in this competition with China, because they obviously have the Falcon 9. They can reuse their launch, and they can offer prices at fractions of the competitors. If China is able to most likely copy or potentially innovate some of it, but copy most of it, to be quite honest, the rocket technology that allows them to have reusable launch and also reap those same benefits. That's pretty concerning, to be quite honest.
And three rocket companies, that's kind of strategic, isn't it?
It is. It's a big deal. If they're able to pull it off, that is strategic on at least two fronts. One would be their domestic. If they're able to reuse rockets, bring down launch costs and everything that comes with that, that allows them to put their own satellites up at a more rapid pace, at cheaper, all of the benefits there. There's a second strategic benefit, and that's on the international market, being able to provide some of those launches to potential friendly countries or countries that they are attempting to encourage to move closer to them by providing benefits like space systems, or the ability to launch space systems.
At a much cheaper cost, yeah. I mean, if they're talking 80 to 90%, I mean, and it's coming from China. So let's not forget that they're more than willing to, lowball just to gain the market, right?
Yes, they have a history of that.
That could be huge. I mean, 3 rocket companies. 3.
It's incredibly concerning. And I think, and real quick, before we get into the final topic, which was looking at Xijian 21 and 25, which I want to get to. I think that we talk about Chinese copying and imitation. I think there's an interesting historical lesson here too. So he didn't pay me, but Ian Toll's World War II trilogy, or World War II Pacific War trilogy. Great, by the way. I got it recommended to me. Been really enjoying it. There was a really interesting section in the lead up to World War II. Funny enough, in about 1938 and 1940, the West said Japan couldn't innovate. They only could copy. They copied aircraft. They copied some of the ship designs and other things. And that was what the West thought going into World War II. They also thought that aircraft couldn't really sink battleships, and they found that out really quick, that doesn't exactly work. But they thought that the Japanese couldn't innovate. And unfortunately, the Japanese were innovating actually pretty well. Particularly the Zero, completely caught the West off guard. I hope that we do not repeat that mistake in claiming that China cannot innovate. I would point out that they can at least copy and apply in ways that it would be argued we have not yet. The comm satellite comes to mind immediately. The fact that there were folks that probably thought of that in other places first doesn't matter because China's the one who put it there first. And so it's important to not get so comfortable saying, well, China can't innovate and then ending there. First of all, I'm not entirely convinced of that. And secondarily, I would say that we don't have a great history of understanding what innovation looked like in other nations.
And maybe innovation really is just using freely available technology and how you use it, right? Also, I mean, there's the refueling mission that China just recently successfully, is my understanding, was able to achieve, right? And they're not the first ones to say it, do it, or what have you. But hey, they're right there.
They're not, but yeah, this is also big news. And in the last week, Xijian 21, Xijian 25 performed a rendezvous in proximity.
Ooh, that's right.
RPO in orbit. The news was reporting that they were indistinguishable, which suggests that they were close enough together that possibly touching, who knows. But I would point out, don't forget, SJ-21 is the same satellite. Shenzhen 21 was the one that grabbed one of their satellites and moved it.
In a graveyard orbit, right?
Correct. And now we potentially have Shenzhen 25 maybe refueling 21. Maybe they're doing something else. Who knows? But interesting. I was doing a bit of reading before this. Shenzhen means learning in Chinese. And it's very interesting. So these are basically their prototype line is how it looks to me. And the fact that they are testing out new capabilities with the Shenzhen line, which allows them to test things that at least they pointed out in the article that the Space Force hasn't officially done refueling in orbit. Now we have some contractors here that have tested that out before, but officially the Space Force has not. And so I think that that's very strategic as well, because once you're able to refuel satellites in orbit, potentially other logistical capabilities, you can maintain a orbital fleet far better than having to launch it constantly, which you do right now. Even with reusable launch, you still have to put up new satellites. And this is why in my opinion, going back to the moon base is kind of important. If you have a moon base, remember, one of the things you can make is propellant. It's pretty easy to get propellant off of the moon. Much, much easier than it is to get it off of Earth. In which case now, potentially, you see the forming. This is why expansion is so important as it moves to exploitation. Once you have pieces moving together, you have gears moving together, you are creating a system of systems that can function far better than the individual systems can in isolation.
So that's actually a real interesting triumvirate, right? Because if you have a system that's on Earth orbit that needs to be refueled, the fuel could be harvested, I guess you could say, from the moon. And then because the moon has less gravity, it's easier to leave the surface of the moon, get into space, go and refuel that Earth orbiting object. But hey, we're kind of running out of time here. So I'd really like to ask you about one last thing. What is in the pipeline that you think that we need to keep an eye on? What's concerning? What's coming?
Yeah, so seeing the development of the triumvirate between the United States and China are really the technical leaders in this, of cheap launch, of persistent space operations, and moon settlement. I think those three legs of the stool are really what's coming up. But I do want to highlight, unfortunately, in space, we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot sometimes, where we have people making significant claims and sometimes they don't follow through. And so it's very important as we continue to move into the second space race that we're in, that we evaluate the claims that are being made by both parties, but particularly by China. To be quite honest, I find that, I mean, the Chinese news agency is incredibly dishonest occasionally, sometimes blatantly so, sometimes less. But the Chinese, for one quick thing, as a quick aside, in the South China Sea, when they were talking with, it wasn't Xi Jinping, I believe it was before him, but they were talking to Obama, and Obama said, hey, don't weaponize the islands. They said, don't worry, we won't weaponize them. We have satellite pictures, open source, showing airfields, anti-air defenses, sub-pens, all sorts of stuff. And now you have the Tiangong, the Chinese space station in orbit, and the latest news just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, maybe even less, they were talking about how they had new satellite guard dogs, quote unquote, that were being put around that could potentially move or grapple with hostile or potentially hostile objects. It seems to me very interesting that China constantly expands in a quote-unquote peaceful way. Once again, back even to the observatory back at Chile at the beginning of this conversation. Expands in a very innocuous fashion. Once they're there, then they can change it into military applications, which is hard. If you try to call it out, you essentially get called out as a slippery slope. Well, they haven't done it yet. This is a slippery slope fallacy. Except with the Chinese, when you start seeing a trend of that starts to be concerning.
Pattern.
Now, yes. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about evaluation? So psychologically, people are wired to find evidence that aligns with what they already believe. So in other words, if I believe that it always rains when I wash my car, as a silly example, but it's a fairly one hopefully most people can appreciate, I believe that it will rain when I wash my car because it's very frustrating when that happens. It probably has happened maybe 2 or 3 times, but as I think back over it, those 2 or 3 times are what stand out as the thing, which is why it's kind of an urban legend. If you wash your car, it'll rain. Unfortunately, there's far less benign versions of this. For instance, if you believe that China is going to lead the world into another century of peace and prosperity, whatever, your brain, if you believe that, your brain will naturally search out subconsciously evidence that aligns with what you believe and will dismiss the evidence that it does not align with that. This is a very dangerous psychological trait, and I would argue that commercials, political parties, lots of folks use this particular mental approach. And as best I can recommend with my observations in this area, the first thing to try to avoid falling into confirmation bias is to intentionally have a reflexive capability of looking at, when I agree with something, why do I agree with it? And then is there any evidence to the contrary? Now, of course, you have to be careful that folks putting out information that's against this They also might be trying to pry on confirmation bias. Maybe it's just propaganda they're putting out. But if there's actual fact-based evidence, actively search that out. Maybe it's possible to learn something from that maybe wasn't grasped beforehand. And it also helps avoid falling into the trap of confirmation bias, just being fed what you already believe so that you continue to believe it.
All right, Josh, we're running out of time, but you really need to wrap this up into a bow. Why is that important for space and defense in China?
I appreciate the question. So, in my opinion, the reason why this is important for China and defense, China claims lots of stuff that maybe they didn't fully do, or maybe they didn't do how they said. And I would argue that possibly other nations. I mean, for instance, you have Iran that in the post that went viral because it was so bad, they claimed to have shot down an F-35, but the F-35 was like the size of 5 city blocks in the particular picture. This is important because it helps make everyone in your audience a more astute consumer of information. And it helps them to spot frauds when they're not as obvious as the Iranians claiming to have shot down F-35s or B-2s, which they claim to as well. Both pictures look incredibly fake. It's usually not that easy. And so it's important when we're evaluating what is actually going on in space and defense to try to be a astute consumer, to try to filter out as far as possible what is not actually useful and what people only want you to believe.
Josh, thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate it, Laura. It was a lot of fun. We'll have to do this again.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.